Official Protocol, the show where saying the Who is the greatest rock and roll band of all time is not subjective, but everything else is. Please take a quick second to like, subscribe, and share with your Who-minded friends. The Who is a passion of ours, and still, no money is made from these podcasts. This is a personal journey. So liking and subscribing lets us know you're not alone in Wholand. Constructive feedback is always welcome in the comments below. I am Ethan. Today I'm being joined by Betts. Tom is on assignment, but he will be back. And Betts is back for the first time in a while, right? Right? Okay. Hi, Betts.
Good to be back. It's good to be back.
We do not claim to be experts, just fans who like to talk about the greatest rock and roll band of all time, The Who. Today's guest is the founder of Krays on ClassicRock.com, where she hosts her blog, The Diversity of Classic Rock. It's about her 8th or 9th year doing that. She has a new book.
9 years. Yep.
9 years. She talks about all things classic rock. She's got a new book out called
Crime of the Century.
Crime of the Century, Classic Rock and True Crime. The star of our 4th highest viewed video on the channel. Please welcome Angie Moon. Hey.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Glad to be back here.
So you got a book out. You wrote a book.
Yes, I did. So that was a few years in the making. So I started it back in May of 2021, and the idea was born in the kitchen. So originally, I was just going to do a classic rock and true crime blog post. Like that was just going to be a regular diversity of classic rock content. But then when I was talking about it with Owen was like, Owen, my husband, in case those who don't know him. Yeah. And then he was like, no, that's got to be your book. So yeah, that just became my first book. 2 of my passions rolled into one.
Tell me about the true crime side of this fascination you have.
So yeah, that all began, and I talk about it in the intro. This all began when my dad got me into true crime by watching documentaries. So every weekend, every Friday night, every Saturday night, we would be watching true crime documentaries on TV. So we would be watching things like 2020, Dateline, 48 Hours. There was this one Lifetime obscure true crime show called What Should You Do? I really enjoyed that one as well. And then when Investigation Discovery came out when I was a teenager, I was hooked. That's what I would be watching all summer long. I would be binging Investigation Discovery. So yeah, I've been into true crime longer than I've been into classic rock, believe it or not. So yeah, that's like 20 years because I was into it since I was 8 or 9 years old.
I think too, like just the idea, especially the early years of rock and roll, are kind of like shady people starting. Like Morris Levy and that kind of thing, kind of mob connected. It very much lends itself to that, or as it were.
Yes, like one thing that I did notice is that there's kind of this narrative frame in there where it talks about the beginning and the end of the 60s culturally. So the first chapter talks about the JFK assassination, which is what people would say was like an end of an era, but also a beginning of an era. Because after that, there's Beatlemania, and then the 60s really became the 60s. And then we also talk about the end of an era with the Manson family and Altamont, and Kent State is also alluded to as well in the Devo chapter.
Yes.
So, but there's no chapter on Kent State, but there is a chapter on JFK and Jack Ruby and the Kinks, right?
No, yes, Jack Ruby was the band.
And the band, sorry, it's, because I was reading about
the Kinks actually have 2 chapters. So there's John Wayne Gacy and there's the Kray twins.
Right.
Let's get into that one, because I know that's the one that, instead of reading like the whole thing, I read a couple pieces really intently, and a big, I was even talking to Betts before this. I think even before the Who stuff started for me, I really got into the Krays for some reason. I knew the movie was coming out. It was weird.
Which movie did you watch? Was it the newer one with Tom Hardy, or was it the older one with the?
I'm an old person.
Spandau
This was 1990.
Yeah.
The Kemps. Yep. Spandau Ballet.
Version, yeah.
I watched one of those Watch Mojo UK lists, and it was like the 20 best British gangster films. So then I started watching these British gangster movies again, and I hadn't seen The Long Good Friday, which is a Bob Hoskins, Helen Mirren one, and that was #1.
Handmade films, yeah.
But it just got me thinking of the star of all those movies, Bill Curbishley. No, I'm kidding. But it also reminded me of that scene in Quadrophenia where Jimmy goes to get the blues. I'm very interested in the Krays. There's a lot in the book about the Krays. And I know Betts has questions, but really quick, you talk about the Kemps from Spandau Ballet and how they got to play the Krays in the 90s. I'm very curious about this this scheme they had going where they would sell the rights to people knowing the full well that the movie wasn't going to get made. And that was news to me. Where
Yeah.
was that? Where did you find that out from?
That was in Roger Daltrey's autobiography. Thanks a lot, Mr. Kibblewhite.
Never read it. No, I'm kidding. I have. I just don't remember. Okay. Great.
I did, but it had a very anti-John agenda, I felt like. So I was very critical.
I love the way that he wrote it. Actually, like, if anything, like, I actually preferred that to Pete Townshend's book because I loved how conversational it was.
It's a real breezy read. I love it. I really, actually, really do love the book a lot.
But yeah, Bets, I know you had some things on the Krays.
Put in here, for the uninitiated, the Krays were twin brothers who were basically ran the criminal underground on the East End. Depending on where you're from, they're either the greatest villains in the world or they're kind of heroes to you. And I think that was Roger's thing. I think Roger kind of likes a villain because you can take the boy out of the bush, but you're not going to take the bush out of the boy. And so he sort of consorted with those hard types. And remember too, in the 70s, he had that free George Davis. George Davis had been wrongly convicted of a bank robbery. There was a whole movement to free him. You see Roger with the shirt and everything like that. And of course, then he got out and robbed banks. It's right back in again. But the Krays were just, they were these guys. They ran the criminal underground. They were pretty tough guys. And interestingly enough, one was totally heterosexual. The other was bisexual. He wanted people to know he was bisexual, Ronnie and Reggie. And they would eventually go to prison because they killed two guys. One was Jack the Hat McVitie, and I think that was the one they went to prison for. But yeah, they were constantly kind of selling the rights to their stories. It was a really hot kind of topic, and people did want to make the movie. The Kemp one was Peter Medak directed it, who was one of the great directors of the angry young men era of British filmmaking. He did Billy Liar and A Day in the Life of Joe Eggers, one of the, so it's a really good movie. I did, when I was in a criminology class at UCF, I did my thing was on the Krays, and I showed the movie, and I just showed that part where these criminals come in to talk to the Kray brothers, and they're like, have you heard of the Beatles? And the Krays say, I believe the Beatles have heard of us, which is kind of how they were. They were a big deal.
Yeah, they were definitely an interesting chapter, and I think it's going to be an interesting read for a lot of Americans because that's a true crime case that very few Americans know about. Unless you're a big nerd or some sort of Anglophile or something, you will not know who the Krays are. It's the same thing like when I talk about like the tornadoes, I vaguely allude to the Shadows. I like to joke that I'm probably their biggest American fan because hardly any Americans know them.
But it's crazy, I definitely think so many important. Bands talk about the Shadows being a huge influence, British bands.
Yeah,
talk about the Shadows were a huge influence on them.
Oh yeah, and everyone knows Apache. Like when they hear that song, it's like, oh, that sounds familiar, because of hip hop. Yeah. But then it's just there's so much more to them than that, and I wish people would appreciate the early '60s more for sure. The song written by a British guy called Jerry Lorden, and then he gave it to Burt Whedon. He didn't like Burt Whedon's version as much, so he decided to give it to the Shadows, who were relatively young guys. Like it's incredible how young they were when they played on it. Like Hank Marvin, I think, was maybe 18 or 19 when he played on Apache. Like very young.
Oh, so I was gonna say real quick though with the Kemp brothers, there is a Who connection, in a few ways that they were, as teenagers. Anna Scher was this woman who came into sort of the lower socioeconomic areas, and would create these workshops for kids to come in and learn acting skills. And among the Kemp brothers, Gary and Martin, are both graduates of her program, along with Kathy Burke, and Phil Daniels. And Dexter Fletcher, who saved Bohemian Rhapsody. He's the director, kind of saved Bohemian Rhapsody after Bryan Singer had to drop out, and then directed Rocket Man. So they all have this sort of pedigree, of the Anna Scher workshop. She just died, I want to say, last year.
About the Krays.
Yes.
Did they pop in your mind when you're going to write this book? What were the first couple, like in that first burst of inspiration after your kitchen conversation? What were the ones that were like, oh, this is great, I have to do this, is what's going in the book?
All right. So it all actually began earlier. So This is interesting. So I talked about this in other interviews before, and I allude to it in the acknowledgments. So there was a friend of mine in journalism class. So in journalism, I hosted a radio show, and so did one of my friends. My closest friend in the journalism class was a guy named Killian. And Killian hosted a radio show where he would just chat and play music sometimes. And he asked me, "Hey, Angie, do you want to guest on my radio show?" And I'm like, "Awesome, let's go." So I go on the show, we chat, and then he decides to play this folk song from the 60s, no context, just plays it, and asks me what I think of it. And I was like, "Yeah, it's a pretty good song." And then he's like, "It's by Charles Manson." And my jaw just dropped. I had no idea that he made music. Like, I knew about the Mansons, but I didn't know about his music.
Yeah.
And then I ended up reading about him and the Beach Boys, and then Dennis Wilson, and how he gave a song to the Beach Boys. And I was like, whoa, this is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward a few years later, I get into the Kinks, and then I read everything I can about them. So then I find out, okay, they ran into John Wayne Gacy in Illinois while they were on tour in Springfield. And they ran into the Kray twins like multiple times. There were multiple encounters with the Kray twins, multiple connections to the Kray twins. I was like, okay, there's something here. There's a lot of these stories about classic rock and true crime. I got to keep finding more and more of them. You know, because I knew there were musicians who murdered people. So yeah, obviously I knew about Phil Spector. I knew about Sid Vicious. I knew about Jim Gordon. And I was like, okay, we're going to go try to collect as much information as we can to write this book. I also did want to include a mafia section. That was something I thought of including when you talked about the mafia bets. I was like, I really wanted to talk about it, but I was worried about being attacked, and I was worried also, it just did not fit into the theme. And then this book, I originally wanted to make it like even bigger.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a part 2 where I talk about Kent State more in detail with the song Ohio. I'm going to be talking about all the different, political assassinations of the 60s, all these different songs about true crime. And then I'm going to talk about musicians who were murdered. So that's... Yeah. It's going to be a hard one to write, but, it's definitely going to be part of the Crime of the Century miniseries, I guess, so to speak.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the title of the book?
Okay, so I came up with the title based on the Supertramp album, Crime of the Century, which came out 50 years ago. I actually have it on vinyl. I should go and pull it out because I should have had it prepared, but yeah. I have that on vinyl, and I thought that's the perfect title. And I looked it up, and I was like, there's no other classic rock and true crime books with that title. I didn't find any other classic rock and true crime books when I was initially doing my research. It was only after the fact that I found them. Like, there's one called Disgraceland, which is a whole podcast, and then there's another one called Rock and Roll Nightmares. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know about these, and they were all very Americano-centric, and I was like, no, I got to write this, and I want to write as comprehensively as possible. So that was my aim in this book.
It's incredible. Like I'm about halfway through the book. It's incredible the near misses. Like again, Dave Davies being invited over by John Wayne Gacy after a show, or Debbie Harry with Ted Bundy. Being offered a ride, that kind of thing. The near miss quotient is very, very interesting. I found that quite. Wow.
There's also Ronnie Spector as well, like the whole thing about Ronnie Spector. So that's in the huge Phil Spector chapter. That's like 60 years of music history I talk about in there. Yeah. And I mean, it's just startling, like the whole thing with Ronnie. It just startles me. I did not know how bad it was. I knew it was bad. I didn't know how bad it was.
John Lennon and the Ramones both said, like, he would just straight pull a gun on you, while you were recording, and at one point pulled a gun on John Lennon during the recording of Rock and Roll, and then John was like, "Man, Phil, I'm glad you like me, like put it down, dude," and he did, but
that was in the book too.
But I mean that Christmas album, am I right?
Christmas album's great.
The coincidence there, the craziest thing is the coincidences between Phil Spector and Joe Meek. Both their murders happened on the day the music died, February 3rd. And Joe Meek had this obsession with Buddy Holly, and it's actually all alluded to on the book cover itself. Like, so here's all the different.
Show us that thing. Yeah.
So here it is. The whole theme is a tarot card. So yeah, I came up with this last minute because originally I wanted to base it off of Irish gravestones, but I couldn't find any stock images that were suitable. So I was like, okay, tarot card, Joe Meek. There we go. There's your reference. The moons, there it is, symbolizing me, Angie Moon. And then the flying V here in the middle. So the flying V was a guitar that was patented in January 1958. That's the same month that Joe Meek went to that fortune teller who predicted the death of Buddy Holly on February 3rd.
Oh, wow.
Now, here's a little more February 3rd connection. February 3rd is Dave Davis's birthday. Dave Davis is one of the people who popularized the flying V. So there's your numerology.
Nice.
All right, so Bets didn't really want to talk about this, but we do talk about the Who here, right? So
Hmm.
we talked about the Krays because let's quick give us the rundown of Roger Daltrey and the Krays for the for the Who content. This is your Who
All
content.
right, so the connections all start in the 60s. Roger Daltrey, starting out, obviously, you're not going to get the big bucks straight away. And Roger Daltrey was kind of broke early on, and he was just driving his car on Salisbury Plain, and he got into a car accident. His car repairs were going to cost a lot of money, and he just didn't have that money, and no one would give him an advance at the record label. So then, he started talking to friends, and one of them was like, "Oh, I know someone who will give you money. They're a bit dangerous, but they'll give you money." And then he handed them, when he got the check, it said Charlie Kray on it. And it was like, oh my God, that's where he got the money from. And they were
Yeah.
like, yeah, I mean, if you don't pay it back, your legs are going to break. Thank goodness he paid it back. And then the Kray twins connections don't end there. Roger Daltrey was about to produce the film, like we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Thankfully, he's very, very smart, and he, made sure that the contract was all ironclad, that if they back out, he doesn't lose money, he doesn't lose anything. So thankfully, it all worked out in the end for Roger.
Yeah. I knew that the book that he was gonna use to base his movie on was The Profession of Violence, which is the book that I had read about them. And it would have been a really interesting take because to me, I felt like the book almost portrayed them as like not terribly competent, in some ways. Like, I mean, like I was like sort of reading it being like, well, American gangsters wouldn't do that.
Right. Like I watched that one Netflix show about like all these gangsters and like the mobsters and how they did it and how they got to the top. And I'm like,
Yeah,
imagine if they did an episode on the Kray twins and it was like, this is what not to do when you're a gangster.
exactly.
Don't do your own dirty work. And they talked to the Italian mafia in America. They visited America once.
Yes,
And the
yes.
Italians were telling them, don't do your own dirty work. Have someone else do it for you. And then they were like, yeah, we're not going to listen to that.
And
We're
that was
so
the thing.
arrogant. The
Yeah.
hubris.
Yeah, I was reading, I was like, these guys don't seem to have it together very well.
They
Well,
gangstered
yeah,
too close to the sun.
Yeah, they did.
well, here's the thing. It's I've seen both of those movies. I've seen Legend and The Krays.
Yeah.
And they're both good, but it both paints a picture of terribly dysfunctional people.
Yes.
Not just the crime, but the way they committed the crime. And what was very powerful in that first one I saw, because the book I had, the last picture is of the two Krays at the graveyard of their mother,
Yes.
and both of them are one of them is in like a mental facility, and one of them is in prison. But they're both allowed to go with the guards, and they recreated that shot beautifully at the end of the movie. And it's kind of like from the murders they flash forward to that scene. But because one is in a facility, he seemed, when he went off, he got very, very, like, almost homicidal.
Hmm.
And the way they paint it in the movies is there's a love for family and the brother there, and so he kind of let his brother do whatever he want, even though it was bad for business.
Yes.
So one of them might have been smart, but the other one was emotional.
Yeah.
And he let her run away with
Yeah,
him.
Ronnie was the one who was at Broadmoor, and then Reggie was in an actual prison. Interestingly enough, Ronnie was never released out of Broadmoor when at the end of his life. While Reggie did get out of prison, he was the one who died later. He did get out of prison for compassionate reasons because he was battling cancer, and then he died not long after.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They also wanted to be celebrities. That's the other thing. They went, from being shot by David Bailey to being tried at the Old Bailey, so to
Yeah.
speak. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that's not what you do when you're a gangster. You're supposed to be anonymous. You're supposed to be in the shadows, not be so flashy. But I guess they were just so obsessed with being new money that they felt the need to show it off. And you can still see that today with the new money versus old money.
Yeah.
But they love their mom, so it's good.
Say
Yeah.
goodbye.
They loved Violet.
And I just before talking to you, I did a little search on YouTube. Just there's all sorts of weird, like, documentaries about them, like all sorts of, like, really weird connections and everything, and they're kind of low rent documentaries, and they're kind of interesting. So that being said, back to the Who for a second. You did do and I was always wanted to ask, because I kind of don't consider this a crime, is the Keith Moon
That's the very last chapter. No, that's not the last chapter. It's the second to last chapter because
Yeah.
Les McEwen's is after that.
Yes.
Right. You know, I don't even like saying it. Keith Moon ran over and killed his driver. And, you know, that kind of followed him, haunted him for the rest of his life. And there's a whole lot in the book about it, and it's very compelling. And it's very sad. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I felt the need to write about that because I did want to include in a special section. Like, I don't think that, you know, he's on the same league as like a Phil Spector or Jim Gordon or anything like that. Not at all. Like, that was a whole accident. It was a tragedy all around. But I still felt it was an important read and an important thing to talk about. And I do empathize a lot with Keith Moon, and I wanted to make sure that I humanized him, just like I humanized Nancy Spungen in the Sid Vicious chapter. Because like that whole thing, like that whole accident with Neil Boland being run over by the car, that was the beginning of the end for Keith Moon. And
It was.
You know, I see so many parallels between him and Les McEwen, where they both had those accidents at a young age, and, you know, they drank and did drugs afterwards to cope. Thankfully, Les lived a few more decades, while Keith, he succumbed to it. He died at 32 years old. And it's, you know, startling to think about that because I'm turning 30 this year, and I'm not far off of 32, the age that Keith Moon died.
Yeah.
And I just think of how much more Keith could have accomplished, what could have happened with The Who had he lived. I don't know. Yeah, it makes me really sad.
Yeah.
This was a big thing, and it followed him for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And
I can't believe he had to go back to performing so quickly. That's the thing that just really gets me there, is just the lack of mental health, you know, concern back in those days. Like, you know, you just didn't talk about mental health in those days at all. Not even the 60s or 70s. No, it was just, you kept going, you kept trucking, and, you know, you were hurting inside. And that's probably why so many of these musicians acted out. You know, you see the same thing nowadays with like The Quiet on Set and Nickelodeon and all these child actors speaking out about their experiences.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, how do you, you know, when you have to bottle it up, you're forced to do it. Eventually it just pops out and you just act up.
But it's also one of those things where this is post-war England, right? And all these things we see are post-war England, and they're, you know, they're Winston Churchill, like, you know,
keep calm and carry on.
Keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
Right? No matter what's happening. And that's part of it, and that's part of what Keith was rebelling against when he dressed up, say, in a Nazi uniform, or, you know, all this post-war trauma everyone was going through.
Yeah, and The Who's the perfect example of that. Like, they talk about, you know, their parents all were part of the war effort, and they came back and nobody discussed anything. You didn't talk about what you went through and what you experienced. And so you had this pressure cooker sort of atmosphere, and then their children, you know, of course, sort of flouted all of that.
And the reason why we talk about it here is because it permeates all this music we like. What I found really interesting in the book was, and I'd like to know where you got this information, the judge in Keith's case could tell what he was putting himself through because of the way he worded what he told him. Like, very specifically, you acted in that situation how you were supposed to act, and you have no culpability. And it obviously weighed on him very heavy regardless. You know what I mean?
Yeah. A lot of that book, a lot of that chapter, a lot of that research was really from Dear Boy, the Tony Fletcher book. That was where I got a lot of the information, a wealth of it. I think maybe some newspaper articles possibly, but yeah, it was largely Dear Boy. Like, that book is definitely one of the best rock biographies I've ever read. That is like the model of what a rock biography should be. It was just purely factual, packed full of information, very well written, very engaging. I think that is definitely what I strive to do with my writing.
Yeah.
You know, the final word is it's an interesting read. I really enjoyed it. It's in things, you know, and you read about what certain chapters about. Like, I'm gonna get to that. I might not get to the Jim Gordon chapter, you know, because I know what goes down there.
You know what went down there, yeah.
Yeah, it's a sad one. Like,
it's bad.
There's some rough things in here, but it's not. It's interesting stuff. You know,
it's a
what I
rough
mean?
business, Ethan. It's a rough business.
It's a rough business.
It's not the book for everyone. It's not a cheery read. It definitely isn't. It's more of a Steven Wilson type of thing, like that kind of mood.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the stuff I just read.
But it's also a thing where if you're in that world and you look around, you might decide to try to be the manager for the Who instead of being in that world.
That's true. It's always amazing to me that a guy who did actual time turned out to be their best manager.
about Bill Kerbersley. Yeah. So, love you,
Yeah.
Bill. Yeah. How can people get the book?
So people can buy the book directly on my website, crazyOnClassicRock.com, or at a bunch of different vendors. I have a whole list of them on the website. So if you go to crazyOnClassicRock.com, go to the Buy Crime of the Century. Click there. You can find your favorite bookseller of choice or buy directly through me. Big thank you if you buy directly through me. Regardless of where you purchase, I really appreciate if you leave a review because I'm a new author and reviews help people know that this book is great and it's not just me saying it, but you guys saying it as well. Don't just take it from me. So leave a review on the Amazon page as well as Goodreads, and that will help me out a lot in the algorithm. If you want a book signed by Bowie, if you buy it through my website, I will get her to sign your book. Like I have a
Very
little
cool.
special ink pad that's used for babies basically to, get their handprint, and it's safe for cats too. So yeah, Bowie can sign books.
Very, very cool.
So you're saying this book is for sale and you can buy it?
Yes.
Okay.
With
Where
Bowie's
is it for
signature
sale?
and my signature.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I have if you want a signed copy, you can only get it through me on crazyOnClassicRock.com, and then it's / buy Crime of the Century, I think, with each between each of the words a dash. But anyway, yeah, if you go to Crazy on Classic Rock, there's a little thing that says buy Crime of the Century. Yeah, if you want a signed copy, if you want it signed by me, if you want it signed by Bowie as well, just request it in the little personalization box when you check out. Otherwise, I have a lot of different options. I compiled the whole list together. I even did a little comparison shopping for people so they can find the best deal. I don't know of any authors that do that besides me. So, but yeah, I do want people to read the book and be able to, and hope it doesn't break the bank for anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a little announcement for the American audience. My parents are actually coming in a few weeks' time, and I'll be able to offer discounted shipping to any Americans who want a copy of my book signed. So you're going to get the best deal possible. It'll be $22. So if you contact me, I'm limited to just 10 of them because that's all my parents can bring back in their suitcase because of weight limits. But yeah, if you want it, yeah, I'll be posting when that deal is available, and I'll post a Stripe link for that. So anybody who wants a signed book for just $22 shipped, you'll have to wait a little bit because my parents are coming here on holiday and they'll have to bring it back and then ship it. But if you have the patience, it's definitely worth it. Worth saving $15.
Folks, get the book.
Hey, Angie, thank you for coming on again.
Yes,
Cheers,
thank you so much.
Well, I enjoyed it so much.